Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Elizabeth Hallam Smith.
Thank you, Robert, and good evening, everybody. Sheen, known from 1501 onwards as Richmond, has held a very special place in the lives of many members of the English royal family, Plantagenets and Tudors alike. And it's a great privilege this evening to highlight for you some of our key royal protagonists and some of the dramatic and at times unexpected events that happened here. So brace yourselves for family and political melodramas, scandals, doomed romances, conspicuous consumption, acts of deep piety, theological convulsions, blood-curdling prophecies, gruesome deaths, and even a haunting. So in its medieval and Tudor heyday, our town housed a royal complex which came close to rivaling Westminster and Windsor as a royal residence and spiritual powerhouse combined. Was indicated here on the slightly later Moses Glover map, we too had our own exquisite royal pleasure palace, together with two wealthy and prestigious monastic foundations of Sheen Priory or Charterhouse and Sion Abbey. Just across the river, but often described as Sion in Sheen, and very much part of our royal enclave. Plus, of course, the observant friars who lived in Richmond Palace. But why here? Well, we all, of course, delight in the River Thames and its surrounding landscape, and so too did people in the past. In 1501, a royal herald described Richmond as an earthly paradise. And Richmond is also conveniently positioned within the Thames Valley, an area particularly favoured by the Plantagenet and Tudor monarchs. Our town lies about 15 meandering miles by boat from Westminster, where the royal administration was headquartered, and in the Middle Ages, it could be reached via the tidal Thames in about a day. On the well-maintained medieval roads, the two more direct 8-mile routes from London on each side of the river could be covered on horseback or on foot in half a day or less. So Sheen was ideally placed as a staging point for Windsor and later Hampton Court, and increasingly became a destination in its own right. Our royal stories begin in around 1313, when King Edward II took Sheen directly into royal hands from Otto de Grandison and lavished money on it to befit its status as a royal residence. Edward's grand new house was located in the walled lower court or down court, with a great gate, attractive residential apartments, and direct river access. Beyond the down court lay the over court or upper court, containing the farm buildings of the manor. Edward and his wife, Queen Isabella, stayed at Sheen Palace together on many occasions. And in October 1320, the youngest of their 4 children, Joan, may well have been conceived here. But this, I'm sorry to tell you, was no scene of domestic bliss. They were a most dysfunctional royal couple, who for most of their marriage were barely on speaking terms. Unpopular with his contemporaries, Edward relied almost entirely on unsuitable and hated male favourites. And through his incompetent, greedy, and corrupt rulership, he progressively alienated his barons and Isabella. This was extremely ill-judged, for she was able and ruthless like her father, King Philip the Fair of France, Edward II's overlord for Gascony. Isabella separated from Edward in 1322, and in 1326 mounted an invasion from France in the name of their young son and heir, Prince Edward. Alongside her was her political ally and perhaps lover, Roger Mortimer, and they had the support of the majority of England's barons. Edward II was captured and deposed in favour of this son, who was crowned as Edward III. Now, Edward II was imprisoned at Kenilworth and then in Berkeley Castle, and in September 1327 was conveniently declared dead. In the 1330s, rumours began to circulate that he had been brutally murdered on the orders of Isabella and Roger Mortimer by the insertion of a red-hot poker into his rectum, a tale that played to his alleged homosexual relationships. I did warn you. But we don't actually know how he met his end, or if perhaps he escaped and wandered the continent for years to come. In 1330, Edward III wrested control of the kingdom from his mother and executed Roger Mortimer. Isabella was disgraced and at first banished, but within a few years, she was back at court again. She enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle from her valuable estates, which included the manor of Sheen, valued at that time at £30 a year. On her death in 1358, Sheen passed back to Edward III, and in the 1360s he spent a massive £2,000 on a great new house here, with kitchens again in the Down Court. Sheen Palace was now worthy of His Majesty and power, and became one of his favourite residences. It was here that Edward III ended his days in 1377. When in 1377 Richard II succeeded his grandfather, Edward III, as a child of 10, the hopes of the kingdom rested upon him. In 1382, he married Anne of Bohemia. Very good match, this. She was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. Very prestigious dynastic alliance, which developed into a love match. The teenage couple soon became inseparable, but the king's early promise soon evaporated. He was neurotic, fastidious, and obsessed with status, and he increasingly struggled with political rivals. It was Sheen that Richard chose as a special place where he and Anne could escape the burdens of his office. He further upgraded the palace with fireplaces and personal latrines and created a beautiful riverside garden. And on an adjacent height in the Thames, known as La Nate, he built a beautiful summer pavilion as a romantic retreat, accessible only by boat, and featuring an elaborate tiled bathroom with brass taps for hot and cold water. But in 1394, disaster struck when Anne died suddenly of the plague, here at Sheen at the age of 27. Heartbroken, Richard arranged a major state funeral for her at Westminster Abbey. Soon afterwards, he commissioned a special statue of Anne to be set in place at Sheen. And then in 1395, in a romantically morbid gesture, he ordered his clerk of works to raze the whole palace to the ground and vowed that he would never set eyes on it again. But the king's thrifty officials did not carry out his orders to the letter, as many of the buildings, especially those of the manor farm in the Overcourt, were left in use. Others, which were timber framed with lath and plaster walls, were carefully taken down and re-erected at other royal houses, including Sutton Manor in Chiswick. Lonely and unhappy, Richard now lost his grip on political reality, and eventually in 1399, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Lancaster, who was crowned as Henry IV. Although Richard was promised that he would live out his days as a captive by February 1400, he had disappeared, presumed dead. He was probably starved to death in Pontefract Castle. In 1413, his body would be reunited with that of his beloved queen in a magnificent tomb in Westminster Abbey, the hands of their effigies entwined as a symbol of their eternal devotion. In 1413, Marshal King Henry V succeeded his father Henry IV and immediately began his great work at Sheen Palace that would make it one of the most important royal houses in the kingdom. he ordered the construction of a beautiful, elaborate, and costly pocket pleasure palace surrounded by a new moat to the southwest of the original house, today under the gardens of Trumpeter's House. This had barely been started when Henry V died suddenly in 1421, and it wasn't completed until about 1450, after a push following King Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445. By that time, it had expanded onto parts of the former Richmond Green. From the Thames, its visual impact would probably have been akin to Hurstmonceux, built in the mid-15th century and still surviving, and shown here. But Henry V liked Sheen so much that he wanted to be able to live here immediately while the work was going on. So he ordered several other royal residences just to be dismantled and put back up in the former park next door. The most important was Byfleet Manor in Surrey, which gave its name to this new part of the palace. Here it was joined by some more recycled buildings, including some from Sutton Manor in Chiswick, previously built from parts of Richard II's palace at Sheen. So some bits of the palace probably came all the way back again. Meanwhile, Henry V wanted to ensure that his own spiritual health and that of his family would be safeguarded forever. Fulfilling a vow taken by his father, Henry IV, in 1414 to 15, he founded two highly prestigious monasteries nearby. They were richly endowed and built on a massive scale, as demonstrated by impressive archaeological and historical evidence published by John Cloke and Robert Cowie. One was Sheen Priory, known also as Sheen Charterhouse, almost complete by 1419. Now, this was a Carthusian monastery whose 30 male hermits lived a life of austere contemplation in cells round a courtyard, served by about 25 lay brothers. The second across the river was Sion Abbey, a double monastery for the equally strict Swedish order of the Bridgetines, containing up to 60 aristocratic nuns, headed by a powerful abbess, served by the 25 monks and lay brothers who occupied an adjacent part of the complex that was entirely segregated from the nuns' area. Trouble that they went to keep them apart is quite prodigious. Sion Abbey was at first sited in an unsuitably marshy spot just across the river from Sheen, but in 1426 it took its name with it and moved to the place that would later become Sion House and Park. Here, work continued on it right up till 1488. Confined inside their high walls, the two communities, situated only 800 meters apart, dedicated their lives and beings to serving God and interceding for the souls of the royal family and the kingdom. The contemporary chronicler evokes their bells echoing in relays across the river flats day and night. Now, at that time, it was commonly believed that the more austere the monastic order, the more efficacious its prayers, which drew throngs of pilgrims to both monasteries. Here, their generous charitable donations were rewarded with indulgences, bringing great spiritual gains, including at Sheen a 500-day reduction of the pains of purgatory, and at Sion, spectacularly, forgiveness for all the sins that each person had ever committed up to that date. The fame of our area was further enhanced by celebrity visitors such as the famous mystic Marjorie Kemp, who came to Sion in 1434, and King Edward IV and his queen Elizabeth Woodville, who in 1472 made pilgrimages to both monasteries. Both monasteries were also renowned for their scholarship and amassed impressive libraries that attracted many visiting scholars. And despite the harshness of their rules, the two communities were permitted to work together to further learning and to deepen their commitment to the monastic life. This is the backdrop to what many scholars see as an earthly, if unconsummated, passion that developed in the years around 1500 between James Greenhalgh, a monk of Sheen, and Joanna Sewell, a nun of Sion. The evidence is some poignant inscriptions in several books and manuscripts that have come down to us from Sion's library. James was a theologian whose task it was to prepare Joanna for her profession as a nun before she took her final vows. As was usual, he instructed her from behind a grille, but the two seemingly managed to snatch a single illicit meeting in person on the eve of St. Valentine's Day, 1504. Over the next few years, James sent Joanna several devotional manuscripts, which he had painstakingly copied, in which, in tiny marginalia, he entwined their initials, IG and IS, to form IGS. In one of these, which I had a look at a couple of weeks ago, a popular work by mystic Richard Rolle, Incendium Amoris, the fire of love, he emphasized the word amor each time it occurred. And at the very end, he added mens est tibi, thinking of you. Below this, Joanna added her name and some now indistinct text, perhaps some personal reflections that her fellow nuns later sought to erase from history's pages. For this romance of the mind was never going to last. By 1508, Greenhalgh's amorous literary encounters had been discovered, and he was banished, first to Coventry Charterhouse, and then, as he remained unrepentant, he was moved on again to Kingston-on-Hull, dying in about 1530. Joanna, who's likely to have been punished with a severe beating, most probably lived out her days behind Zion's walls in solitary confinement, separated even from her sister nuns. She was buried there in 1532, just a few years before the two monasteries were swept away in the Reformation, of which more anon. Well, like Henry V before them, Henry VI and Edward IV often visited Sheen Palace and were active patrons of both monasteries. But after Henry Tudor had defeated and killed the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, and taken the throne as Henry VII, he elevated these royal connections to a whole new level. In this, he was supported by his domineering mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and his loyal queen, Elizabeth of York. In the 1490s, Henry VII began to rebuild Sheen Palace, which by this time had become very dilapidated. But a major fire in 1497, which destroyed the chapel and ripped through other parts of the building, prompted a major rethink, greater ambition, and an acceleration of the works. By 1505, when the project was completed at the dizzying total cost of £20,000, King could boast a glorious show palace to his name. This incorporated parts of Henry V's moated mansion, which had been repaired after the fire, enhanced and adorned for the Tudor king. To its north, connected by a covered bridge, was the elegant Fountain Court, around which lay new chambers for the king and queen and a great hall and chapel. All were richly adorned to proclaim Henry's august royal heritage, his martial prowess, political power, and piety. In the hall stood a grand row of sculpted English kings famed for their valor, culminating in an impressive statue of Henry himself. In the magnificent chapel on the other side, there were frescoes of saintly rulers, such as Edward the Confessor. To this potent symbolism were added the signifiers of the new dynasty: roses, dragons, lions, and portcullises, featured on the fountain at the centre of the court and in the elegant passageways leading between the suites of chambers. Beyond this courtyard, on the Richmond Green side, lay the much larger Great Court with its many service buildings. Its gatehouse and western range survive in part today. Famously, in March 1501, the king renamed Sheen as Richmond. Shown here are some entries in the works accounts that mark this moment. I don't know if you can see them, but the one on the left-hand side says Sheen, works Sheen, S-H-E-N-E, and on the other side, on the right-hand side, it says Richmond, works Richmond, and they're literally 2 pages apart in the works account. Now, this was a mark of great favour to our town, since the title of Earl of Richmond in Yorkshire, granted by Henry VI to his father Edmund Tudor, was the name by which Henry had been known during his exile in France. Richmond in Surrey now became Henry's special dynastic seat and most visited royal house. Here he held court, received visiting dignitaries, and staged many of his great events of state, including in 1501, the culmination of the marriage celebrations of his eldest son Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. The festivities included a pageant, solemn masses in the chapel, lavish feasts, hunting, jousting, and an acrobatics display on Richmond Green. Locals and visitors alike could witness the royal family in all its power and splendor, doubtless observing that Prince Arthur, a rather weakly lad of 15, was attended by his stronger and healthier younger sibling, Prince Henry, aged 10, the spare. And as already mentioned, the Lancaster Herald, who was here, enthused that Richmond was an earthly paradise, a beauteous example of all proper lodgings, founded upon the Thames's side, set between diverse, high and pleasant mountains. The towers of this excellent place, he continued, are turreted and pinnacled, and on every pinnacle and tower is a vein of the king's arms, painted and gilt with rich gold and azure. To give thanks for his dynastic success and good fortune, Henry VII founded another new monastery at Richmond, a house of the very strict observant friars, whose large and imposing church may be seen on the far right of this drawing. Henry VII granted the observants part of his gardens in the Byfleet area of the palace, where the modern street name Friars Lane still reflects their presence. But no sooner had the construction of his new monastery begun than he was struck with tragic misfortune. His beloved son and heir, Arthur, died in 1502, followed by his cherished wife, Elizabeth, in 1503. 2 other children had died in infancy. Now the completion of Richmond Priory became an offer of reconciliation to the God that Henry thought had abandoned him. Work on the impressive church and the conventual buildings was pushed through at speed, so that it was completed in 1509 at the substantial cost of £1,500. Almost nothing of it survives today apart from a boundary wall. Now, in his last years, Henry VII maintained a close relationship, not just with Richmond Priory, but with Sheen Priory and Sion Abbey as well. These monasteries supplied the royal family with confessors, spiritual advisors, and organizers, while maintaining their constant round of intercession, as evoked by this rare and richly symbolic altarpiece long associated with one of them. It features a striking image of St. George and the dragon, below which are Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, united by an angel and supported by their children, both living and dead, a focus for prayers for the royal family. And it was here at Richmond that Henry VII died in 1509. Now, would you like to hear about Henry VIII? Henry VIII, his successor, would, of course, change England forever. His transformation from a handsome Renaissance prince to a bloated, dangerous, and much-wed tyrant is the stuff of legend, but the reality was far more complex. Henry was cultured and intelligent, yet self-indulgent and lazy, self-righteously pious, yet extremely superstitious, charming and charismatic, yet prone to towering and terrifying rages and deeply vindictive behaviour. And to posterity, the man and his reign provide endless fascination and perplexity. No sooner had he succeeded his father in 1509, aged 17, than Henry married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, an act requiring a special dispensation from the Pope, as it was prohibited by church law. During the first decade of the reign, the royal couple spent much of their time here in Richmond, enjoying glittering feasts, entertainments, and tournaments. But not until 1516 did Catherine give Henry the heir he so craved, and she was, of course, a girl, Mary. By that time, the Queen had lost at least 3 sons through stillbirth or in early infancy. In Henry's eyes, this became a failure that he began to see as a sign of divine retribution for their marriage. All the while, the king was promoting himself as a champion of Catholic orthodoxy. In 1521, he issued this tract, in part at least ghostwritten by his advisors, condemning the Protestant views of Martin Luther. For this, Pope Leo X awarded him the special title of Defender of the Faith, something that the British sovereign still holds. Meanwhile, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, his powerful chief minister and also papal legate in England, was trying to reform the Catholic Church from within. He held up the strict rules followed by our 3 monasteries as the gold standard that all the other monks should follow, prompting terrified protests from the rather lax Benedictines that their monasteries would soon be completely depopulated. By 1527, Henry VIII was enraptured by the accomplished, vivacious, and strongly Protestant Anne Boleyn, and he resolved to obtain an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could wed his new beloved. Wolsey's inability to achieve this led to his fall in 1529. In 1531, the king had lost all hope of a papal sign-off and declared himself as supreme head of the English Church instead of the Pope. Backing him in all this were Anne's Protestant supporters, including his new chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. The English Church now conveniently declared Henry's marriage to Catherine to have been invalid. So he cast her aside and in 1533 married Anne Boleyn. Their one surviving child, Elizabeth, was born later that year, but after this, Anne, like Catherine before her, lost several more babies through stillbirths. The last, in 1536, would have been the son that Henry so craved. Richmond Palace was at this time merely one of the king's lesser residences, but the repercussions of Henry's split from Rome were to have overwhelming repercussions for our 3 royal monasteries here, as for the 800 or so others right across the kingdom. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, confirming the king's status as head of the church and requiring his subjects to swear an oath of allegiance that recognized it. Failure to do this was, Parliament also ruled, high treason, incurring the death penalty. Most people complied, often reluctantly, but not so some high-minded humanists or courageous monks and nuns, particularly of the more austere orders. Many would lose their lives as a result. These included Hugh Rich, the warden of Richmond's observant friars, who came out against Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn and was hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1534. His observant order, which had for so long provided trusted confessors for the royal family, was shockingly now suppressed, and many of the Richmond friars were thrown into the Tower of London, where they were starved to death. The Sisters of Zion refused to take the oath, remaining defiant in the face of a visit from Queen Anne Boleyn. Brandishing service books in English, Anne subjected the learned nuns to a lecture on Protestant theology, which received a frosty reception. But astonishingly, the sisters escaped the royal wrath, as did most of the monks of Sion and Sheen, although that was because the men had been coerced into taking the oath. But one Sion monk, highly respected theologian Richard Reynolds refused to comply. He was convicted of high treason and condemned to death, alongside 4 leading Carthusian monks. On the 4th of May, 1535, the men were dragged on hurdles through the streets of London amidst jeering crowds, still wearing their clerical garb. Then at Tyburn, one by one, they were partly hanged by the neck, cut down while still conscious, castrated and disemboweled, and their entrails burned. Their heads were chopped off for later display on London Bridge, and their bodies cut into 4 quarters to be displayed as a grisly warning. Richard Reynolds was the last to be killed and had to watch his companions meeting their gruesome ends. But he preached eloquently to the crowd and is said to have suffered his hideous death with joy. That same day, another local man was hanged, drawn, and quartered alongside Reynolds and the Carthusians, the elderly and inoffensive John Hale, vicar of Isleworth. He too had refused to take the oath of supremacy, but in addition, he'd probably been framed for naming Henry VIII as the Mouldiwarp, a cursed ruler who, as prophesied by mythical magician Merlin, would bring the country to ruin. Such a seditious notion would have deeply unsettled the superstitious king. But by now, the Queen Anne Boleyn had also fallen victim to Henry's paranoid wrath and was beheaded in May 1536 on trumped-up charges including adultery, incest, sorcery, and treason. Her successor, Jane Seymour, at last gave Henry the male heir he so greatly desired, Edward VI, born in 1537, but she died soon after the birth. Henry's insecurities now increased yet further. Ever more corpulent and in constant pain from a suppurating leg ulcer, he was an extremely dangerous person to be around. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and vicar general, was overseeing the dissolution of the monasteries in the name of church reform. The lesser houses went first in 1536, after which the greater monasteries were closed down one by one up to 1540, greatly enriching the royal coffers. At Sheen Priory, which surrendered to Cromwell in 1538, 10 of the monks who opposed its dissolution were covertly starved to death in the tower. But the rest either escaped the continent or were given generous pensions and allowed to leave in peace. The Sion nuns refused to hand over their abbey to the crown. So in 1539, Cromwell simply repossessed it through a legal quibble. The sisters and monks departed, drawing the pensions on offer and organizing themselves into small groups. Some remained in England, while others went into exile in Belgium, carrying their most precious possessions, including a stone pillar from the Sion Abbey gatehouse, to which part of Richard Reynolds' body had been nailed after his execution. You can see a picture of it on the slide. Soon after this, in 1540, Henry VIII granted Richmond Palace to Anne of Cleves as part of a generous settlement after the annulment of his short-lived marriage to her. Thomas Cromwell, who had organized the marriage, came out of this episode far less well, losing his hold over the king and then his life. In 1542, a similar fate awaited Henry's 5th queen, the flighty and adulterous Catherine Howard, who was detained at Sion before her execution. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, somehow managed to survive the perils of royal wedlock and supported the king through the last grim years of his reign until his death in 1547. But divine retribution awaited Henry at Sion, when on 14th of February, his vast funeral procession halted there on its way to Windsor. His coffin rested overnight in the former Abbey church. Here, congealed bodily fluids oozed from it and were licked up by a local dog, seemingly fulfilling a prophecy made by an observant friar, William Peto, back in 1532. God's judgments were ready to fall upon King Henry's head and dogs would lick his blood as they had done to Ahab, that most wicked of biblical kings. Well, the immediate successor to the monstrous Henry VIII was his 9-year-old Protestant son, Edward VI, clever, godly, and priggish. The real power lay with his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. Already in possession of Sheen Priory, Somerset soon grabbed the former monastic site at Sion. Here he began to recycle the fabric into the magnificent Tudor house, which is essentially what's there today. In 1549, Somerset was ousted as Lord Protector by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, and soon Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland now took Sion, while Sheen went to his ally Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk. But by early in 1553, it was clear to all that the young king was suffering from a terminal illness. The ailing Edward feared that his legal heir Catholic, Princess Mary, would dismantle his religious reforms. So, influenced by his advisors, he nominated as his successor Suffolk's eldest daughter, Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII on her mother's side and a Protestant. In May 1553, Jane was married to Guildford Dudley, Northumberland's son, and on Edward's death in July 1553, to her fear and consternation, she was proclaimed queen at Sion, aged only 16. But young Jane's notional reign lasted for less than 2 weeks. Backed by the populace and much of the nobility, Mary successfully asserted her right to the throne, and her forces soon captured Jane and her husband. Both were beheaded a year later in the aftermath of a dangerous anti-Catholic rebellion. Mary's mission was to purify England and return it to the Catholic faith of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. With the support of the man she chose as her husband, Philip II, the powerful Catholic King of Spain, who in England was much resented. Between 1555 and her death in 1558, the Queen killed for their faith around 300 Protestant men and women, burned at the stake as heretics, executed as traitors, or starved to death. All the while, Philip and Mary spent much of their time together here at Richmond Palace, to the despair of many foreign ambassadors who were forced to rent lodgings in the town at ruinous expense. Mary twice believed that she was expecting her much-craved heir, but both were phantom pregnancies. Eventually, in 1557, she brought in from the cold her half-sister Elizabeth, from 1558 her named successor, who had wisely professed Catholic beliefs. Mary and Philip laid on a lavish pageant and feast for Elizabeth here at Richmond. Meanwhile, 6 of England's monasteries made a rather low-key comeback, including 2 of ours. Sheen Charterhouse was re-established under the leadership of Prior Maurice Chauncey, and 19 of the scattered and elderly nuns of Sion Abbey with 3 monks returned from their travels, residing now in Sion House, which had replaced much of their former convent. This English monastic revival was short-lived. After Mary died on the 17th of November 1558, Elizabeth succeeded her sister as Queen Regnant. Now Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she returned her country to Protestantism. Within a few months, Elizabeth dissolved her sister's monastic foundations once more, and the monks and nuns went back into exile on the continent. Elizabeth I, the last sovereign to regard Richmond as her home, is another legendary character. Good-looking, intelligent, well-educated and personable, she was an impressive orator and astute politician. Subverting all the norms of her day, she eventually rejected the bonds of matrimony, declaring herself married to her kingdom, the Virgin Queen, who was the equal of any former King of England. Her artfully curated image of herself as Gloriana evoked her grandeur, power, wealth, and authority. But she could also be difficult, inconsistent, indecisive, and frequently distant from day-to-day decisions which she left to her advisors, most notoriously in the case of the execution of her cousin and heir, Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. By Elizabeth's side almost constantly for much of her reign was her handsome favourite, Robert Dudley, later Earl of Leicester, the man she might have married. To enable him to keep her company during her many sojourns at Richmond, Elizabeth granted him a mansion and lands nearby at Kew. Dudley's adherent, Dr. John Dee, the celebrated astrologer and alchemist, entered the Queen's service, and Elizabeth several times visited him at his house in Mortlake, seeking predictions and signs, although many dismissed Dee as a mere sorcerer. Richmond Palace, now repaired and beautifully maintained, was the scene of great events and diplomatic visits. In 1581, Francis, Duke of Anjou, Elizabeth's last suitor, made an extended stay here, his substantial entourage occupying both the main inns in Richmond, the Lion and the Bell. But predictably, it all came to naught. And throughout the reign, many entertainments were laid on for the court here, such as masques, dancing, and plays. Some of the plays were staged by the Earl of Leicester's men, a troupe that included a certain William Shakespeare. By the mid-1590s, beneath her huge red wig and thick mask of white makeup, Gloriana was noticeably flagging, her face haggard, her remaining teeth black, and her speech indistinct, although her mind was still sharp. She spent a lot of her time at Richmond, especially around Christmas, describing the palace as her warm winter box. Her comfort was doubtless much enhanced by the installation here of the newfangled water closets, flushing lavatories, the invention of her godson, Sir John Harrington. But weakened by a series of tragedies, in March 1603, the Queen became seriously ill with pneumonia. She took to her bed at Richmond, and after assenting to the succession of James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, she passed away peacefully in her chamber, aged 69. While her Privy Council prepared for an orderly succession, Queen's maternal relative, Robert Carey, famously jumped the gun by rushing off to the court of King James at Edinburgh with the news. Tradition has it that he took with him as proof Elizabeth's beautiful gold locket band, today known as the Chequers ring. As the new Stuart monarch readied himself to claim his inheritance, Gloriana made her final journey by barge from Richmond to Whitehall. Amid scenes of public mourning, here she lay in state for almost a month before her burial at Westminster Abbey. Now, had Elizabeth I looked out of her windows on the north side of her warm winter box, she would have had a clear view across to Sheen Priory, which at times during her reign lay largely empty and deserted. Did the Queen realise that her subjects at Richmond were astounded and terrified by the lingering spectral presence of the community of monks that she had dispatched into exile from this very place? For in 1571, a Catholic exile from England visiting Sheen's last prior, Maurice Chauncey, and his monks in Bruges, reported that there were ghostly hauntings here. The local peoples had, he said, for 9 nights in a row, seen lights in the deserted church and heard monks singing services. The astonished spectators had even identified the voices as belonging to some monks who'd been buried in the priory's graveyard. But when eventually they plucked up the courage to climb up ladders to peer inside, the ghostly worship suddenly ceased. Well, today our great royal buildings have been largely lost from sight. There are only fragments remaining of Richmond Palace and Sion Abbey, and of Sheen Charterhouse, there's nothing at all to be seen above ground. Its last remains, the hamlet of West Sheen, were demolished by royal architect Sir William Chambers to make space for the King's Observatory, and today lie beneath the fairways of the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Club. But our town, in its royal heyday, lives on through the work of the many expert scholars, curators, and archaeologists on whose work I've built for tonight's talk. And of course, through all of us, who admire and appreciate Richmond's royal past.
It remains for me to thank Liz again for a fantastic talk. I mean, really interesting. And the characters that she was talking about, I think it's the last week, but if you haven't been to see the exhibition of Holbein paintings and drawings in the King's Gallery, it's well worth doing that, because there are some splendid pictures there which brings all this to life. So again, thank you very much. Please show your appreciation, and to our volunteers.